thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you for showing up. What I'd like to do over the next 30 or 40 minutes is to tell you very briefly why I wrote the book, what the problems are that we confront, and some of the steps that need to be taken to address these problems. I wrote the book for several reasons. One, I thought after 42 years with the United States Army, the CIA, the State Department, and the Department of Defense, 42 years of security clearances, I thought there was a lot of information that could be shared. There's too much that's kept from us. And I think we're learning so much from Edward Snowden's revelations, no matter what you think of Edward Snowden, and I know he's extremely controversial, but the fact of the matter is he has changed the debate in this country entirely. He's changed the debate among groups of public activism, such as your various groups, and he's even changed the debate in the Senate and on Capitol Hill generally. I also wrote the book because this bloated military spending has to be reduced. It has to get under control somehow, and I offer reasons in the book for why we need to do so, and I offer steps for what could be cut back. I wrote the book also because I thought the United States 20 years ago missed a very important strategic opportunity. That was that brief period, less than 2 years, between 1989 and 1991, when things happened that we did not expect to see in our lifetime. The Berlin Wall came down, the Warsaw Pact was dissolved, that is the Soviet and East European alliance system, and then in December 1991, the Soviet Union itself came apart at the seams. These are the things that were not anticipated, and they offered a major strategic opportunity to the United States to do things differently, to do things about military spending, to do things about all of the bases we have overseas, most of which are no longer necessary, and actually we've done nothing about that. And then about several years ago, in the first term of Barack Obama, there was a Secretary of Defense who I know very well by the name of Robert Gates, who started telling people, started telling close friends before he made any announcement, that it was time to resign and retire and go back home to the state of Washington. And the reason why he was doing so was because he did not like the trend that he was seeing toward a smaller military, because I think there is a consensus now for reducing the budget. We just don't know how to go about it. But what Bob said was we were going to get a smaller military that's going to be able to go to fewer places and be able to do fewer things, and I don't want to be part of that. My feeling was that's exactly what we need, a smaller military that can go to fewer places and do fewer things and get involved in fewer places. So that's why I decided to write the book. Now, I start the book with the chapter on President Eisenhower. And I do that for several reasons, because of what he said and because of what he did. Now, we're all familiar with the military-industrial complex warning. That was in his farewell address. And actually, I was going to Johns Hopkins at the time he delivered the farewell address. The president of Johns Hopkins was the president's brother, Milton Eisenhower. And I was on a student committee that met with Milton Eisenhower from time to time. And after the farewell address, he met with a few of us, and he said, you know, I saw the draft of the speech in my brother's hand, and he had written in congressional. So it should have been military-industrial congressional complex, because that was the real problem. But when he delivered the speech, he left out the Congress. And when Milton asked his brother, why did you do that? He said, you know, Milton, it was enough to take on the military and industry. I couldn't take on the Congress too, but that is the problem. But there were other warnings that Eisenhower gave over the years. He gave a speech in his first term called the Cost of American speech, in which he talked about all of the money that was going into the Defense Department, into the military that wasn't needed, which was taking away from the domestic needs of the country, the very thing that your groups are concerned with. And he had a wonderful line that he himself wrote. Dwight Eisenhower is a much better writer than people ever understood. Whenever General George Marshall needed a memo to go to the president, it was always General Eisenhower who wrote that memo. But he wrote that we're spending money on the military. We're spending not just our resources and our treasure, but we're spending the sweat of our laborers, we're spending the hopes of our children, and we're spending the genius of our scientists and engineers. We can't afford to do that over a long term. The third warning that he gave was the warning that was very similar to what some of the founding fathers said, particularly James Madison. And that was the warning that in any environment of permanent war, you're going to see serious restrictions of personal liberty and civil liberty. And just think about the last 10 years with the global war on terror, and look at the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, and look what has happened to the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the Sixth Amendment, and the Eighth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment is the one against illegal searches and seizures. Well, we're learning more about that every day. You can't pick up a newspaper without learning, particularly from Edward Snowden's revelations, how our liberties have been compromised by the massive surveillance program. The Fifth Amendment talks about due process, and since Bradley Manning, Chelsea Manning's name was brought up in the introduction, think about due process. Think about the Sixth Amendment on a fair trial. Did Manning get a fair trial? I really don't think so. He was held in jail for over 3 years before he went on trial. The Sixth Amendment talks about a fair and speedy trial. He was held in solitary confinement. He was tortured. Clearly, there was no fairness. And when you think about due process, think about the killing of an American citizen by the name of Awlaki, a clergy, an Islamic clergy, but there was no due process involved, and even though some people justified that killing, what about 2 weeks after Awlaki was killed, when his 16-year-old son was killed because he got into an SUV that went out to look for his father somewhere in the desert in Yemen, and that SUV was hit by a Hellfire missile from a drone aircraft, and the 16-year-old, an American citizen, was killed. Certainly there was no explanation ever offered by the government for what was clearly a violation of due process. And then, of course, the Eighth Amendment that prevents torture and abuse. Think of all of the torture that took place in United States prisons, secret CIA prisons throughout Eastern Europe and Southwest Asia, particularly Afghanistan. And look at the military presence, look what took place in Guantanamo over a period of years, and look how many people are in Guantanamo and have been there for 10 or 11 years and have faced no charges whatsoever. And then the final warning that Eisenhower gave was a warning that he did not write. It was a warning that he gave in a conversation in the last weeks of his second term. It was January 1961. And he was just ruminating with his close advisors, and he said, you know, and this is close to exactly what he said, God help the United States when the people who sit in this chair after me do not know how to talk to the military, do not understand the military, do not know how to deal with the military. And the argument in my book, which concentrates on the 20 years since the strategic opportunity that was never taken, is that by and large our presidents have not known how to deal with the military. So when you look at the 4 presidents that I deal with, each one has a chapter: George Herbert Walker Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. In the case of 2 of them, Clinton and Obama, I think they were intimidated by the military, and it took them a long time to learn how to deal with the military. And of course, in the case of Bush 1 and Bush 2, too much was given over to the military. But Eisenhower didn't just say the appropriate things. He did things that were very important. His willingness to accept a stalemate in Korea, the Korean War, was an extremely important development. And maybe he got away with it because he was a former commander of not only American forces but Allied forces, and he had credibility on that level. He reduced the defense budget. He certainly controlled, to a certain extent, his neoconservative advisors, particularly the 2 Dulles brothers, the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, and the CIA Director, Allen Dulles. And finally, when you look at the pressure that was put on him to use the military to get into Vietnam, where he was pressed not only by the Dulles brothers, but his Vice President, Richard Nixon, he refused all of these efforts to get involved militarily in Vietnam. And of course, the Bay of Pigs operation, which was such a disaster for the Kennedy administration, that was conceived during the last 2 years of the Eisenhower administration. and Eisenhower thought it was madness and gave it no support whatsoever, but unfortunately left it on his desk, essentially, for a very young and naive president to deal with in the very first months of his first year in office. So Eisenhower is important from that standpoint. Now let's look briefly at the four presidents, Bush, Clinton, Bush Jr., and Obama. All four of them failed to deal with the strategic opportunity. If you look at George Herbert Walker Bush, and I worked for him for a very short period of time, he was director of the CIA, he had the perfect opportunity to change American policy because he had two major developments that played to his ability to conduct executive policy. One was the end of the Cold War with the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, but the other was the very successful use of military force in Iraq, in Desert Storm. And I think what Desert Storm did particularly was to expose the political cynicism of George Bush, because it was clear that he had nothing in mind in terms of taking advantage of those successes. Just compare that to Margaret Thatcher in London, and whether you agree or disagree with how Margaret Thatcher ruled her country, the fact of the matter is when she had a military success in the Falklands, she moved immediately into the domestic arena to make significant changes. So she had a program, she had an agenda, she was programmatic in the best political sense of the word. George Bush had nothing in mind and nothing was done, and if there was any policy that came out of the Bush administration, it was a policy of unilateralism. And it was a policy that was designed by the people whose names will be familiar to all of you from the Iraq experience. It was a policy of unilateralism that was written by Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney. And if you look at the key advisors around Dick Cheney, it was Scooter Libby, Douglas Feith, and Paul Wolfowitz. The very people who brought you the disaster in Iraq were planning 20 years earlier for a very heavy-handed military policy until the doctrine of unilateralism was leaked to the Los Angeles Times. A senator, who happened to be Joe Biden, jumped on this doctrine and it was stopped in its tracks. But what Bush really did that was unfortunate was to ignore the policy of containment as written by George Kennan, who really was the doctrinal champion of how we should deal with the Soviet Union, and I think we dealt with the Soviet Union successfully if you look at how the Cold War ended. But people ignored the last aspect of containment, which was once the Soviet Union moderated itself, not even Kennan felt it would come apart, but he felt they would become more moderate. He argued that once the Soviet Union moderated itself, that would be the time to anchor the Soviet Union to the Western security architecture, the Western security alliance systems. And that's exactly what George Bush didn't do. He did not anchor the Soviet Union to NATO in any meaningful way. He didn't anchor the Soviet Union to the important Western economic and political institutions. And to make things worse, and we saw this in the Clinton administration, instead of anchoring the Soviet Union to the West, we took NATO and expanded it and drew the Cold War alliance system closer to the borders of Russia. So think about this in the context of a Bush administration that told Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, the Soviet president and the Soviet foreign minister, that if you get your troops out of Germany, remember when Germany was trying to reunify in 1989 and 1990, there were still 300,000 Soviet and Russian troops in Germany. And James Baker, our Secretary of State, told Shevardnadze, the Soviet foreign minister, if you get out of Eastern Germany, we will not leapfrog over Germany to go into Eastern Europe. That's exactly what Bill Clinton did when he expanded NATO. When he brought in the former East European members of the Warsaw Pact, that was leapfrogging over Germany to bring the NATO alliance system closer to Russian borders, which has created an anger in Russia that exists to today. You know, when we have problems with Putin, remember there's a certain legacy that Putin believes in terms of how the United States handled the demise of the Soviet Union and exploited the collapse of Soviet power. And this is not far away from Putin's thinking when he has to deal with the United States. But this wasn't the only mistake that Clinton made. I think Clinton was an incredible disappointment in foreign policy. He himself said he didn't get elected and come to Washington to conduct foreign policy. He wanted to be a domestic president, and I think most people give him high marks for the way he handled the domestic political and particularly the economic scene. But on foreign policy, I think mistakes were made, not only the expansion of NATO, but giving in to the neoconservatives of the 1990s, people like Senator Jesse Helms from North Carolina, Newt Gingrich in the House, who had the contract with America, and they were calling for a weakening of the national security system other than the Pentagon. So what Helms and Gingrich wanted to do, and Clinton caved in to their efforts, he could have blocked their efforts. He wanted, Helms wanted, and Gingrich wanted, an end to the United States Information Service and an end to the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. Now, ACTA, the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, was an extremely important professional group of arms controllers. I was involved with them when I was at the CIA and the intelligence advisor to the SALT I talks. These were talks that were administered and managed mainly by ACTA arms control professionals. They were responsible for SALT I and the ABM Treaty, the INF Treaty in the 1980s. So when Clinton gave in to these demands from Helms and Gingrich and others, he really weakened the U.S. ability to conduct arms control, and he made it easier for his successor, George Bush, to really undo arms control as we knew it. But Clinton was responsible for more than that, because there were a lot of international agreements that could have been signed in the 1990s that he favored, where he caved in to the influence and the power of the Pentagon, which opposed international agreements. Not only arms control, Clinton was in favor of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the Pentagon resisted it, and Clinton gave in. Clinton was in favor of the ban on landmines, which should have been done in the 1990s, the Pentagon resisted, and Clinton again gave in. There was an international agreement to ban the use of cluster bombs, which are so dangerous to innocent civilians. Clinton favored it, Pentagon resisted, and he gave in. International Criminal Court, the same thing. There was resistance from the right, and Clinton caved in. So in all of these areas, I think Clinton was a major disappointment in terms of using U.S. power successfully to enable the United States to seize the high moral ground on things like disarmament and arms control and international agreements in general. So when Clinton moves aside and George W. Bush comes into power, you really have probably not only the worst president in terms of national security in my lifetime, but in terms of a president who weakened the United States. I can't think of an American president who set us back more than George W. Bush in his 8 years. We're talking not only about the Iraq War and the distortion of intelligence, and my previous book, previous to this one, was The Failure of Intelligence, when I deal with how intelligence was manipulated by the White House and the CIA to make a case for the use of arms that was based on tailored intelligence. It was created out of whole cloth. If you look at the October 2002 National Intelligence Estimate, 28 allegations with regard to Iraq, all of them are false. If you look at the speech that Colin Powell gave to the United Nations in February of 2003, only 6 weeks before we went into Iraq, that speech was written from the National Intelligence Estimate and repeated these false allegations. And remember, in the winter, in between the estimate and Powell's speech, there was a meeting in the White House between the President and the CIA Director, George Tenet, in which Bush asked for more intelligence that he could take to the American people to make the case for war. And of course, it was Tenet who could have been a hero if he stood up to the President and told truth to power, but he didn't. He said that would be a slam dunk, Mr. President, to give you the intelligence that you need. And the important thing about that is Bush wasn't asking for intelligence to justify the decision to go into Iraq for his own purposes. He wanted to take an argument to the American people. He was going to go into Iraq regardless. You know, people to this day, they read memoirs of people like Bush and Cheney and Powell and Condoleezza Rice and Donald Rumsfeld, and all of them argue it was because of bad intelligence that we went into Iraq. Bad intelligence had nothing to do with it. It didn't help the matter, but Bush and Cheney had made a decision to go into Iraq, I think even before 9/11. What 9/11 did for Cheney particularly, who wanted this war, was to provide a pretext for going to war. People have always asked me, because it doesn't come out of Cheney's memoirs, why in the world did Cheney want this war so badly? And I'm convinced that Cheney, ever since the 1970s, when he was chief of staff for Gerald Ford for a very short period of time between Nixon and Jimmy Carter, felt that Vietnam had compromised the power of the presidency. He wanted to rebuild the power of the presidency, and the best way to do that is to create a wartime president. So Iraq served that purpose for Dick Cheney, and it certainly served that purpose for George Bush, but it ruined the economy and the political standing of the United States, and we're going to be paying for that war for a very long time. The estimates already in terms of Iraq and Afghanistan are upwards of $4 and $5 trillion that will be allocated in addition to the loss of blood that we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan. But that wasn't the only damage that George Bush did to the United States. He single-handedly really killed arms control. When he abrogated the ABM treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, that was the cornerstone of strategic deterrence. He abrogated it without any justification whatsoever because he wanted to deploy a national missile defense, which is now up but not running. It's up in California and Alaska. It's still the most expensive single item in our defense budget, about $10 billion a year. Operationally, it doesn't work because it can't tell the difference between a genuine missile and a decoy. But now you have generals who want to put it on the East Coast to guard against intercontinental ballistic missiles from Iran, of all places. And I'll get to the Iranian situation in a few minutes. Obama has sort of made this problem worse because he's returned to the idea of putting a regional missile defense into Eastern Europe, again to guard against missiles from Iran. You know, you have to be a real science fiction specialist to come up with a scenario that would find Iran having any interest to attack Eastern Europe and the nations of the Balkans. It makes no sense whatsoever, but we can do it because we think we have the technology, and so we're going ahead and doing it. Bush has hurt us significantly in ways that revolve around the torture and abuse that we saw during the global war on terror, the CIA secret prisons, the extraordinary renditions that took place during the global war on terror. All of this has contributed to the lack of standing that the United States now has in the international community, setting the stage for Barack Obama and a chance to really reverse a lot of these policies because he campaigned on that basis. And I think a lot of the disappointment that so many of us, particularly progressives, feel toward Obama is instead of taking on the military, as Eisenhower probably would have done, he seemed intimidated by the military. And if you look at the Obama first term, think of how many military people were given jobs that should have gone to civilians, which enhanced the power of the Pentagon and weakened the power of the State Department. A retired Marine general was made the National Security Advisor. General Jones could not do the job and he was out within 18 months. But if you look at the intelligence czars that Barack Obama has appointed, they've all been retired generals and admirals. He even put General David Petraeus in at the CIA for a brief period of time, but Petraeus had his own way for dealing with that one. And we didn't have to deal with Petraeus for a very long period of time. But there were too many military people put into civilian positions. Some of the retired generals who supported him during the election campaign were awarded with ambassadorships, including the ambassador to Saudi Arabia, who was a brigadier, a retired brigadier, a general, a former colleague of mine at the National War College, a good man, no background whatsoever, however, in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf. So I think what Obama wanted to signal in that first term is that he wasn't going to make waves in national security policy. I think that's why he kept Bob Gates on as the Secretary of Defense, something he should not have done. He appointed a Secretary of State who had no background for the position, no real expertise. I know there are a lot of supporters for Hillary Clinton, and I'm not going to take that one on because it looks like if she decides to run, she's going to be nominated and will drain all of the money out of the political system. But she was a very poor Secretary of State, and I'll have more to say about that when I talk about John Kerry in a few minutes. So really the things that Obama could have done in the first term, he didn't take on because I think there was this intimidation, which led to the surge in Afghanistan, which made no sense. The only good thing about the surge of 33,000 is he put them in 2010 and he took them out in 2011 and 2012. So that 33,000, that was so-called surge into Afghanistan, are no longer there, and I think we are on the right glide path to get our troops out of Afghanistan. I'm hopeful about Obama, however, for several reasons. It's cautious optimism, but at least it's optimism. Last spring, May 23rd of this year, he gave a speech at the National Defense University. And for the first time, he grappled with the entire notion of this global war on terror and the resolution that was passed after 9/11, and the need to redress it, to go back into the Congress, to go back into the legislative branch, and rewrite the congressional resolution that authorized force against terrorism. And basically, he's made that argument in terms of the success we've had that I don't think Obama has gotten proper credit for, particularly against the forces of Al-Qaeda, where we've been extremely successful in Afghanistan and to a certain degree in Pakistan. We've seen the spread of terrorism, but it's not really terrorism that threatens the United States. If you look at what's happening in Yemen and Somalia and Mali and North Africa in general. We know he wants to close Guantanamo. He hasn't been forceful enough. In fact, the problem with Obama is the rhetoric is always extremely impressive. The language is always sterling. The operational follow-up is usually lacking, and we're seeing that in the case of that speech. But if you look at the way he pulled all of our troops out of Iraq, the way he's moving to pull most of our troops out of Afghanistan, the way he was criticized, but I think did the right thing in Libya, where he led from behind. Whether we should have even acted in Libya is another matter, but it's clear he wanted that to be a very modest intervention. And there was no question that over a 2-year period, he dragged his heels in using military force in Syria. And even when he was on the verge of using that military force, at the last minute, he changed his mind, actually pulled the rug out from under John Kerry, threw the issue into Congress, for which he was criticized. But frankly, I thought that was a remarkable turn of events that took a certain amount of courage to have the military poised in terms of the 4 destroyers that were off the Syrian coast with dozens of cruise missiles, highly accurate cruise missiles, and then to end that at the last minute was not an easy decision. He made it alone, which is often how he makes decisions, but I think it turns out to be the right decision because of the success we're having in destroying the chemical weapons capability in Syria, which military force could not have done. And with the same certainty that we have now with 100 inspectors in from the United Nations and the Assad government cooperating with these inspectors to turn the chemical weapons over to an international group for destruction. So for that reason, I'm somewhat optimistic. Now the question is, and I deal with this in the book, what do you do about this situation? And I have several chapters that deal with that. One, the chapter that talks about cutting $1 trillion from defense spending, which would not weaken us over the next 10-year period. And the other chapter deals with the need for a revival of diplomacy, which I think we're seeing to a certain degree under Secretary of State John Kerry. In terms of cutting the defense budget, you have to keep in mind that the United States spends more on the military than the rest of the world combined. And if you look at the spending of the United States and the expenditures of our allies, of our friends, where we would never have confrontation, that's comparable to 75% of the spending of the global community on defense. If you look at Russia and China, who are considered to be adversaries in some way, you're only talking about 8 to 10% of total defense spending in the international community. So we spend an overwhelming amount of money on the military. And if you look at the services, there's tremendous bloat in all of the services and tremendous changes that could be made. We spent over the 40, 50 years of the Cold War $5 to $6 trillion on nuclear weapons, on strategic weapons. We built 70,000 strategic weapons over the period of the Cold War. How many strategic targets do you think there are in the international community? What are you going to do with a weapon that to me has no utility whatsoever? I think one of the most irresponsible decisions made by Moscow and Washington was in this overbuilding of strategic weapons. And remember, when the Pentagon went to the Congress to get increased expenditures, increased appropriations for strategic weapons, if you go back and read the justifications, the same thing was always said. If we spend more on strategic weapons, we can have cuts in conventional weapons and cuts in military personnel. Well, that never happened. You got more strategic weapons, you've got more Air Force capability, and more naval capability. Right now, if you look at just our Coast Guard, and if you put that on a list of the largest navies in the world, the Coast Guard would be the 7th largest navy in the international community. If you look at the Marine Corps, and remember, the last time the Marines did amphibious landing was 1951 in Korea. There have been no amphibious landings since then. The Marine Corps has more military power than Britain. The Air Force has overspent. There is no Air Force that can compete with the United States Air Force. There aren't going to be any air-to-air engagements. We've built aircraft that we couldn't even use in Iraq and Afghanistan because they're too sophisticated. And if you look at the current leading system that the Air Force is developing, the F-35 fighter aircraft, even Senator John McCain, who has never seen a weapon system that he didn't fall in love with, said he got sticker shock when he looked at the price for this one. This will be the first $1 trillion weapon system. It started out at $70 to $80 million a plane. The cost is now already up to $170 million a plane. They're not only building the F-35 for the Air Force, they're building a variant that will land on an aircraft carrier for the Navy. They're building a variant that will have a vertical takeoff and landing capability for the Marine Corps that hasn't conducted amphibious operation in 60 years. And we're building, well, originally we were going to build 3,200 of them. Now we're down to 2,200, but we're learning from the drone technology that we're probably facing the day when we're going to have an Air Force without pilots anyway. The year 2011 is a very interesting year in terms of Air Force training manuals. That is the first year in which the Air Force trained more drone pilots, because they do have crews that are on land in the United States and in foreign communities. But we trained more drone pilots in 2011, about 350 of them, than we trained conventional aircraft pilots. And I think you're going to see more of that as time goes by. In addition to the cuts that you could make in the Air Force and save hundreds of billions of dollars, you could say the same thing for the Navy. You know, what is so sacred about this number 11 in terms of aircraft carriers and carrier task force? How effective will the aircraft carrier be in future operations? Most of the war games that were coming on as I was leaving the War College dealt with China. China has built a very successful cruise missile capability, anti-ship capability, which means we will not be able to bring our aircraft carriers close enough to China to have the aircraft that fly off of these aircraft carriers have a reasonable chance of hitting targets in China or in vital areas of Asia, for that matter. So again, the planning hasn't kept up with the changes in the strategic community. And when you look at personnel, you could severely cut the 540,000 troops that are in the Army or the 220,000 troops that are in the Marine Corps. You have a military that takes advantage of 800 to 900 military bases and operating facilities around the world. Name another country that has operational capabilities and operational bases around the world. Name another country that has the power projection capability that we have. I'm not saying we shouldn't have some of this, that we shouldn't defend the interests that we have that are international interests, but we've gone way beyond what is necessary for that defense of national security. Let me say a few things about the non-defense area, which needs to be built up and restored to the traditional way that America conducted foreign policy. The United States is the only country I'm aware of that uses its military to conduct foreign policy. You don't see that anywhere else. And because of that, we've seen a real decline in the importance and the influence and the political power of the State Department. Now, part of that is because we've had a series of extremely mediocre secretaries of state, and I'm bipartisan here, Democrats and Republicans. I would go back 20 years to find an effective Secretary of State, and that would be George Shultz under Ronald Reagan 30 years ago, and James Baker under George Herbert Walker Bush in the late 80s and the early 90s. So if you look at all of the Secretaries of State under Bush and Clinton and then Bush Jr. and Obama's initial appointment, you have very routine Secretaries of State who had no idea about expanding the strategic interests of the United States through the use of diplomacy. John Kerry is the first Secretary of State, and granted he's made some mistakes, but look at what John Kerry has done in just a period of months that was ignored for 4 years by Hillary Clinton. If you look at three of the most serious problems we confront in the Middle East and Southwest Asia, that would be Syria, Israel and Palestine, and Afghanistan. Now, in all three, he's got a difficult task, but we see a Syria that's destroying its chemical weapons. That's certainly a diplomatic success. We're moving toward an agreement with Afghanistan, a status of forces agreement that will get most of American troops out of Afghanistan. I'd be a lot happier if all of our troops were out yesterday, but nevertheless, this is movement in the right direction. And he has the Israelis and the Palestinians at least talking. We don't know how these talks are going, but that might be a good sign. I fear that Israel has gone past the point of no return for creating a Palestinian state, but at least he has the two sides talking, and there's reason to be at least hopeful about some chance of success. What needs to be done in terms of diplomacy, and Kerry's going to have to go further, is ending this ridiculous policy of non-recognition that a very moralistic United States has put into operation, starting with Woodrow Wilson and the Mexican government 100 years ago. If we don't like a government, if we don't find its moral standards are sufficient to our own tests, we don't recognize it. So we don't recognize Iran, we don't recognize North Korea, we don't recognize Cuba. These are exactly the countries that we should have diplomatic relations with, the countries that we have problems with. Being a foreign service officer in Britain and France and Germany is not exactly a challenge. Being in places like Cuba or North Korea or Iran would be an important place for American representatives to conduct diplomacy, and it would give an opportunity for intelligence officers to collect intelligence for countries we know very little about. We know very little about North Korea, and frankly, I don't get the impression that we're very well informed about Iran. So this is a change that could be made in terms of diplomacy. I guess my final concern would be that is, if you look at the relative advantage of the United States, even though I know it's very fashionable to talk about the United States in decline, and certainly there's some things that we need to do that we can no longer afford to do at home or abroad, but there's no rival for the power of the United States. If you look around at the countries that would be rivals, Russia, severe internal problems. China, even worse internal problems. India is not going to be a rival for the United States, not even in South Asia. The European community still has not gotten its act together on international economics or international politics, for that matter. The United States still has incredible advantages of geography and demography, power projection, military power, intelligence collection. We don't need to rely just on the military. And to paraphrase Mark Twain, if the only tool you have in your toolbox is a hammer, all your problems are going to look like nails. And frankly, for the last 20 years, if you look at our presidents, too many problems have looked like nails. So with that, I'd like to throw it open to your questions, your comments, and see if I can be helpful. And
Well, good meeting.